Hello, everybody. It's Constitution Day. I'm not sure whether we say Happy Constitution Day or not. What do you think?
Yes, happy.
Happy Constitution.
It's a good thing we got it.
We're here today to talk about citizenship in the Constitution, and we have three distinguished members of Clemson's faculty. I'm going to ask each of them to say something about themselves when it's their turn to speak. I will identify them and tell you the order in which they're speaking. First is Professor Lasser, second is Professor Burton, and third is Professor JEMISON. And we're going to make sure that we have time for discussion, so don't despair that you don't have an opportunity to speak. You definitely will. Ready to go?
Thank you. Well, my name is Bill Lasser. For many years, too many to remember, I taught constitutional law. My colleague Danny Frost does now in the political science department. This was always a big day. And I'm now the director of the Calhoun Honors College. So I appreciate having a chance to play constitutional law professor for the day. Kind of makes me a little bit nostalgic for teaching that course. I'm a little jealous that you get to do it. So our topic today is citizenship, and we're going to set this up by giving you some background on the concept of citizenship. I'm going to talk about the theory of citizenship a little bit, and then we'll get, as we sort of continue along in the program, closer and closer to some of the key issues that are out there and controversial today, and I think that we'll have a kind of background to have that conversation. So let's think about the concept of citizenship and where it comes from. Citizenship was an ancient concept, goes back at least to the ancient Greeks, and it's a modern concept, a very modern issue. But in between, it sort of disappeared for a while. In medieval times, there was really not much of a concept of citizenship. Why? Because the concept of citizenship is the concept of being a member, having some standing, having some role in a city, in a polis, in a government. Typically, in ancient times, a small one, and in Renaissance times, in a small city. The structure of the medieval polity, however, had really no need for a question of who belongs to this political system. The key players were, of course, the king or the queen and the pope at the top of the structures, some nobles who had certain privileges, and then a bunch of subjects. And subjects came and went. They had no particular rights. They had no particular role in the government. They might be compelled to do various things. In some places like Russia, they could be literally bought and sold with the land. And so there was no need for this idea of who is a member of the city. The problem, the issue arose again in response to a problem that came about, particularly in the 17th and 18th century, or I should say a series of problems that came about in the 17th and 18th century. And I want to talk about four aspects of citizenship that arose, some of which have ancient roots, some of which are more modern, and talk about sort of how they developed in response to these problems that were identified. First of all, beginning particularly in the 17th century, and even more so in the 18th century, you begin to have a lot more movement of people from place to place. You see this in Holland, which is a mercantile republic. Navies begin to be built up in places like Holland and England and elsewhere. Colonies are established around the globe. People leave, they flee from various places, they end up in other places. And so questions arise of what we might call questions of nationality. To which country or regime, or even king, do you belong to? At a time when people were playing no particular role, didn't have any particular active role, they were largely peasants, this was less of an issue. But when people showed up somewhere and wanted to participate somehow in the civic life, in the life of the public life, in some way, and that could be political, but it could also be economic, the question came up of, are you one of us, or are you not? And there were a number of solutions to that problem. The most obvious was birth. If your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were from here, then you're from here. That obviously did not have medieval roots in terms of its application to the common people, but it had medieval roots in terms of the structure of the regime. So the hereditary concept of power kind of begot a hereditary concept of citizenship. But another issue came about when colonies, in particular, were established, and especially as you begin to see peoples moving back and forth between various countries. And that's the idea of really twin idea of, number one, identity. To what country do you belong? How do we determine that? And secondly, a question of citizenship by territory. You're here. Are you a citizen? Are you not a citizen? So those three sort of methods for dealing with this problem. In the past, we kind of didn't care who was a citizen, and it didn't matter anyway, and people weren't moving around, so if we had such a concept, it would have been fairly easy to determine. But now this various movements of peoples gives rise to this question, and we have to come up with some question of nationality. Inevitably, that becomes a legal question, because the question of national identity, of citizenship in that sense, is a question of what rights do you have, what duties do you have, what powers does the regime have over you, and what roles, opportunities, duties do you have vis-a-vis the regime. So that has to be determined in a legal way. And so, not surprisingly, people like the Dutch legal scholars are very interested in this concept of citizenship, as well as later courts everywhere. So that's one issue. But a second issue arises in the 17th century with the rise of what we call consent theory. This is the argument that you're probably all familiar with from Hobbes, from Locke, and others, that a society and a government is formed by the consent of the people, as the Declaration of Independence declares. Consent implies a certain degree of what we might call standing. You count enough to be allowed to consent. Someone cares if you consented or not. Prior to consent, you just were a subject. Now, to become a part of this polity, you have to take some role. It could be active, it could be passive, but it has to be consensual. It has to be an active consent of one way or another. Citizenship thus develops into what is described as a compact or contract between the citizen and the sovereign. It is an agreement either among the citizens or between the citizen and the sovereign. And again, it establishes these rights and duties, as I spoke about a few minutes ago. One question that comes about is, how do you consent? And this is debated at length. Do you have to formally consent, or as Locke says, can you tacitly consent, meaning you don't say anything, you just show up and you consent to be governed? Do you consent because your parents consented, hence tying in this idea of birth? Do you consent by showing up on the territory? Again, that's sort of Locke's idea, tying into this idea of territorial citizenship. So it gives a question of number one, how do you consent? Number two, who has consented? Again, that's the legal question. And number three, what do you do about people who are not from here, as they say around South Carolina? You're not from here, are you? You're transient, you're just sort of passing through. You are an immigrant, but you haven't decided yet whether to consent or not. You are a foreigner living for some protracted period of time, but remaining loyal to your home country. Again, how do you get from those statuses, to the status of citizen? Thirdly, we have an idea that develops of what we might call active citizenship, or the theory of the good citizen, the theory of the active citizen. Because citizenship carries with it certain duties, also certain privileges or rights. Rights to act in certain ways, and duties to act in certain ways and under some circumstances. So we have, for example, the right to vote, or the right to select your leadership. That can be extensive or it can be more limited. the right to participate in other ways in government. It can be economic rights, particularly the right to work or the right to sue in court. But active participation takes on the sense that a good citizen is an active citizen. So there's this sense that citizenship is not merely a passive legal notion. It's also a sense of how does one behave. One behaves now as whereas again in the past you were just a passive standing around being acted upon by government. Now you're supposed to play a role. And so there are questions about how do you play that role? How do you play that role well? What does a good citizen do? And then in the extreme sense, there's an ancient idea. That's 5 to go or 5? 5 to go. Good, thank you. In the extreme sense, there's a sense of what it is to be an ideal citizen. And citizens are citizens more and more in this classical sense of republics. What does it mean to be an ideal citizen of the republic? And as Rousseau points out, echoing the ancients, an ideal citizen is one who has given him or herself up completely to the homeland or the fatherland, puts the interest of the community over their own interest. Like the Spartan mother who was captured outside the city gates of Sparta by the Athenians, and she asked if she could say, look, my children, you can have them keep them while I go back in the city and get a few things. And the Athenians said, well, okay, we figure you'll come back. We got your kids as hostages. And she goes back into Sparta, and she climbs up on the ramparts, and she says, you can keep the children. I can have plenty more for Sparta. Now, that's the ideal citizen. My personal life doesn't matter. It's the community. Now, very briefly, because we're going to touch upon, my colleagues will touch upon this, and we can talk about it in the Q&A and discussion. But I want to touch on American citizenship in these 4 areas. I'll do that very briefly. First of all, American citizenship is a complicated question, and the legal definition of American citizenship has always been complex. And it draws upon all of these different aspects of citizenship that I talked about in terms of nationality. What is called jus solis, there's something about those hills. If you're born here, you are a citizen. That's an old idea. Territorial definition. Birth, because the Congress has extended citizenship to the children of American citizens, even if born abroad. As well as identity and choice. The Congress decided, I believe, 1922, that a woman did not lose her American citizenship just because she married a foreigner, but rather had the option. It took till 1922, but she had the option to choose to keep her citizenship. Similarly, American citizenship has always been about standing or status, and that's best seen by exclusion, which I know we're going to talk more about. Citizenship is defined by who isn't a citizen in the United States. Women, Native Americans, slaves, free African Americans, as in the Dred Scott case, Asians, as in the Chinese Exclusion Act. We've always used the exclusive side of citizenship to define, in a sense, the inclusive side of citizenship. We are as much asking who's not a citizen and who can't be a citizen as we are who is a citizen. So standing matters. Active participation matters. We have this idea of duties of citizens, perhaps less obvious than it used to be. But think of the New England Town Hall, active participation. Think of the I voted stickers that you get. All right? I'm a good citizen. I'm an active citizen. I voted. Or as Oliver Wendell Holmes said once, taxes are what we pay for civilized society. That same root of citizen in civilized. So we pay our taxes, we vote, we have to do those things. And finally, although we don't like to think about it as much in America explicitly, we do also have a very strong sense of that Spartan mother, of that Rousseauian idea, a classical idea of the ideal citizen. It runs contrary to our ideas of individuality, and so it's problematic in America. But there is what I like to call the Iowa mother, the mother of children who she sent to war, and who she's done so voluntarily, sadly if they're killed in action, but with a certain sense of pride that her family, her children have done their duty. That's very real in America. Think of first responders and the way we honor them. Just had the anniversary of 9/11, because they are putting the community above themselves. And that's that sense of ideal citizenship, which even in an individualistic society remains very powerful.
I'm Vernon Burton. I'm a historian. I have appointments in sociology and computer science. For 34 years, I taught history at the University of Illinois. I taught Southern history. Then I wrote a book on Abraham Lincoln, moved back home, only to discover that people down here don't care very much for Lincoln. But that's relevant to our discussion of the 14th Amendment because it's directly related to Lincoln and his emerging vision based on the Declaration of the United States and the Constitution of the United States. I would add that I have also testified in federal court about issues not only voting but about citizenship as well that can come out in discussion. Now, Lincoln believed that the 1863 proclamation, Emancipation Proclamation, was, as he said, the central act of my administration and the great event of the 19th century. And he stated if he's going to be remembered for anything, that it would be for the Emancipation Proclamation. But I believe it was actually Lincoln's understanding of liberty that became the greatest legacy of the age. If you'll just imagine a typology where on one hand you have total freedom, on the other hand you have total unfreedom, and you put the Emancipation Proclamation on there without the right to vote in a democracy, or as Bill so eloquently put it, I think, in terms of your participation level, where does that leave you? And so I think that while Lincoln's legacy includes emancipation, it builds upon it by specifying in the U.S. Constitution equal citizenship and voting rights. I like to point out that out of the Civil War, you actually have two opposite sort of themes, feelings emerging at the time. There's one of idealism, of which this 14th Amendment is a part of, and one of hatred, which is anytime you have war, you have to almost create a hatred or a reason to be willing to kill other people. Now, historians have popularized the idea of the American Civil War as a second American Revolution. If we understand the Civil War as a continuation of the ideas unleashed by the American Revolution, then Lincoln, I think, was the prism through which the legacies of the Revolution are brought into play in the years leading up to the Civil War and into the war itself, as well as those consequences of that second American Revolution. The Declaration of Independence inspired the American Revolution, and I like to think of it as the Declaration being our mission statement. Then the Constitution, of course, is our rule book. Lincoln, who believed in the Declaration and what it says and equal rights under the law, really brings the two together during the Civil War and changed the Constitution by incorporating the Declaration of Independence. In other words, he took our mission statement and put it into our rule book. Frederick Douglass, who was the greatest black leader of the 19th century, believed, like Lincoln, when he spoke in 1857, that the Constitution, as well as the Declaration of Independence and the sentiments of the founders of the Republic, give us a platform broad enough and strong enough to support the most comprehensive plans for the freedom and elevation of all the people of this country without regard to color, class, or clime. Lincoln revolutionized personal freedom in the United States. He changed the meaning of person, smashed the notion of human chattel. He assured that the principle of personal liberty was protected by law. The 13th Amendment outlawing slavery, the 14th Amendment that we look at today granting citizenship, and the 15th Amendment the right to vote. Now, the latter two, of course, are passed after Lincoln's death, but they are part of this idealism that spires out of Lincoln and the Civil War. They radically changed how power was and is delegated and what rights and liberties are assured to individuals under the U.S. Constitution. Rather than a list of limits to government authority, what Congress shall have no law respecting, the Civil War amendments specify governmental authority. Congress shall have the power to enforce the provisions. The extent of a citizen's social, civil, and political rights remained open debate, but the Constitution now committed the power of the federal government to the equal extension of these rights. This is a new role for government. Back in 1791, reacting to what they believed to be the tyranny of Great Britain, opponents to the proposed U.S. Constitution demanded a Bill of Rights that would spell out safeguards of individual citizens. The First Amendment begins, Congress shall make no law respecting. After Lincoln, the Constitution defined a new birth of freedom, articulated especially in his Gettysburg Address, and they included citizenship and the right to vote, and gave the federal government the power to uphold these individual liberties. In both the Gettysburg Address and then again more eloquently actually in the second inaugural, Lincoln also spoke about our unfinished work. And that is partly what I think we'll be discussing tonight with the 14th Amendment. Thus, to summarize the background and repeat a little bit, Part of the legacy of Lincoln, especially his new birth of freedom, involves a redefinition of the role of government in securing liberty. Prior to the Civil War amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, we the people wanted freedom from government. The Bill of Rights was protection from federal abridgment. The new Civil War Reconstruction amendments, including the 14th, stated that Congress has the right to infer certain rights of citizenship, that is, not to be a slave, the right to citizenship if born in the United States, and the right to vote. Lincoln then institutionalized positive liberty. I like to think that Lincoln anticipated the philosopher Isaiah Berlin on positive and negative liberty. Lincoln often spoke about the difference between two antagonistic groups who, quote, declare for liberty. Some, he said, use the word liberty to mean that each man could do as he pleases with himself and the product of his labor. Others held the word liberty to mean for some men to do as they please with other men and the product of other men's labor. He proffered a parable to nail the point. The shepherd drives the wolf from the sheep's throat, he said, for which the sheep thanks the shepherd as a liberator, while the wolf denounces him for the same act as a destroyer of liberty, especially as the sheep is a black one. Well, Lincoln's call for a new birth of freedom was clearly marked in these new amendments to the Constitution, none of which were inevitable at all of which promised to embrace the equality of opportunity that transcended any particular and exclusionary right. Well, Lincoln revolutionized personal freedom in the United States by assuring that it was protected by law. We can see Lincoln's devotion to the Declaration of Independence that inspires the 14th Amendment. You can go back at least to the 1850s, a decade before the Civil War. In 1854, Lincoln proclaimed, "Let us readopt the Declaration of Independence, and with it the practices and policies which harmonize with it." And he continues, "If we do this, we shall not only have saved the Union, but we shall have to saved it as to make it and to keep it forever worthy of saving." In 1858, in an extemporaneous speech in Chicago, Lincoln said, "I should like to know if taking this old Declaration of Independence, which declares that all men are equal upon principle, and making exceptions to it, where will it stop? I have only to say, let us discard all this quibbling about this man and the other man, this race and the other race being inferior, and therefore they must be placed in an inferior position. Let us discard all these things, unite as one people throughout this land, until we shall once more stand up, declaring that all men are created equally." Now, specifically to birthright citizenship, there's been a lot of debate and specifically a lot of criticism of President Obama for not sort of propagating what most presidents in American history have done, and that is American exceptionalism. Now, ironically, birthright citizenship is one of the most unique arguments that you can use for American exceptionalism. Only the United States and Canada have birthright citizenships, not the European countries. It was the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, that gave the country this 14th Amendment. Now, ironically, many of the presidential candidates, if you listen to the debates last night, of the party of Lincoln are calling for the repeal of this interpretation of the 14th Amendment that children born of undocumented immigrants are recognized as citizens of the United States. Only after the Civil War was citizenship ever a real issue in the United States. The original Constitution mentioned citizens, but did not define or delineate who was not a citizen. A law of 1790 did restrict those from abroad who wanted to become citizens to any, and I quote, free white person. Thus, from the beginning of our country, we link race and citizenship. Slaves were never considered a part of the body politic, but in 1860, at the beginning of the Civil War, there were 500,000 free African Americans in the United States. In 1857, in the Dred Scott decision that Bill mentioned, the Supreme Court had declared that no black person could be a citizen of the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation and then the fighting of some 200,000 African Americans for the Union in the Civil War changed the equation. In June 1866, Congress passed and sent to the states to ratify the 14th Amendment, and it was ratified in 1868. You might note, not by Kentucky until 1976. New Jersey withdrew its ratification, as did Ohio and several other states, and Oregon, in fact, Ohio did not re-ratify until 2003. So the 14th Amendment's a little more controversial than you might imagine. The beginning or original statement of the amendment is all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the states whereby they reside. Native Americans were excluded because they were thought to have sovereignty as tribes, and that was not changed until 1924. Also, the children of foreign diplomats' wives were excluded, and children fathered by occupying armies. So at least since the War of 1812, we've not really had to deal with that part of occupying armies and children, but you might think about Vietnam and the issues of my generation in a reverse way. Well, the 14th Amendment was intended to address the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision of 1857, but a number of issues were raised and discussed at that time. Would it include the children of gypsies or Chinese? Senator Lyman Trumbull, who had been a good friend of Lincoln's from Illinois, chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee and stated it and said that it meant all persons, just as it was stated in the United States would become citizens. George William Curtis was one of the founders of the Republican Party, a very influential Republican spokesman as editors of Harper's Magazines. He argued that the 14th Amendment was part of the spirit of the Declaration of Independence that changed the United States from a government for white people to one for mankind. Basically, at the end of the Civil War, there was no such thing as illegal immigrants. Almost anyone who wanted to come to the United States was welcome. Only later would the United States introduce restrictions saying that lunatics, anarchists, prostitutes, polygamists were restricted. In 1882, all Chinese were prohibited from coming to the United States. Thus, the Chinese after 1882 would be the closest analogy to illegal immigrants or undocumented workers that you hear discussed today. In 1898, the U.S. Supreme Court spoke directly to the issue of children born to Chinese who were in the United States in U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark. The United States government tried to keep Ark out of the United States when he returned actually from his second visit to China, on the theory that because of his Chinese parents, he was subject to the jurisdiction of China, not the United States, and therefore they did not fit within the words of the 14th Amendment and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, meaning U.S. jurisdiction. That part of the 14th Amendment actually refers to the children of diplomats, not like Wong Ark, whose children were working in San Francisco when he was born. So that case deals exactly with the argument that having foreign parents disqualifies the child from citizenship. And the Supreme Court said no, that Wong Kim Ark was a citizen of the United States. It's interesting to me as a historian who's written a lot about this, that the great supporter of African American rights in the civil rights cases, the slaughterhouse cases, as well as Plessy versus Ferguson, all of those cases where the Supreme Court ruled against the rights of African Americans as citizens, Justice John Marshall Harlan gave his name the Great Dissenter because he dissented on that. He was also, though, one of the two dissenting justices who supported the United States to deny Wong Kim Ark's entrance into the United States and birthright citizenship.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth JEMISON. I'm an assistant professor of religion in the Department of Philosophy and Religion. And although my background's in religious studies, today I'm going to be putting on a little bit more of my U.S. historian hat to think about some issues with the Constitution and citizenship. Unlike my colleagues to my right, I've been at Clemson for a whole month at this point, so I'm still learning my way around. But I'm glad to be here. And I'm grateful for the chance to talk as sort of part of this Constitution Day panel. In the next few minutes, I want to paint some of the ongoing challenges of citizenship in the United States after the ratification of the 14th Amendment. So in some ways, the 14th Amendment was meant to solve a lot of issues, to reverse the Dred Scott decision. But I want to focus on some of the ways that, particularly in cases of gender and race, citizenship was still something of a malleable category. People could inhabit different degrees of citizenship based on issues of gender and of race. Women, and especially married women, provided some really interesting examples of who had citizenship and of what caliber and what quality. So I want to think about two different questions today. First, what rights did all US citizens share? So what did citizenship actually mean for people? And secondly, who could gain or lose citizenship? And what can we learn from that? So what rights did citizens have, and who could gain and lose citizenship? So first, it seems that the 14th Amendment provides certain rights. It says that everyone who is born in the United States or naturalized has citizenship in the nation and in the state. And it says, in the words of the amendment, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States. So what were those privileges or immunities? I'm going to tell you a story about a woman named Virginia Minor. Virginia Minor was a white woman who lived in St. Louis County, Missouri. She was a leader of the women's suffrage movement there in Missouri, and in 1872, she tried to register to vote. Her application was denied because she was a woman, and she went to court to protest this issue. And she argued that because of the 14th Amendment, because she was a citizen, she had the right to vote. The Missouri High Court ruled against her. She went to the Supreme Court, and the US Supreme Court again ruled against her in the case Minor versus Habersat. But I think it's important because that decision said that citizenship did not include the right to vote. It didn't include the right to vote for Virginia Minor because she was a woman. That would eventually be overturned in the 19th Amendment, which was ratified in 1920. But even after that point, that decision could be cited as indication that citizenship did not necessarily include the right to vote. And that would come up again in cases when African Americans were suing for their own right to vote and saying as citizens they should have the right to vote. And this case would still come on there. So in some ways, what those rights and immunities was very ambiguous, and it definitely did not necessarily include the right to vote. So that active participation of a citizen really was only for a certain set of citizens at that time. So, and I want to look at that second question. Who could gain or lose citizenship in the United States, and how? So the 14th Amendment is meant to address a lot of those questions. The Dred Scott case had ruled that African Americans, including free African Americans, were not citizens. So this idea of birthright citizenship is this American exceptionalism. It is this amazing idea. And so it should seem pretty self-evident who citizens are and who citizens are not. Everyone born in the United States is a citizen, and anyone naturalized is also a citizen. It seems pretty clear. But it wasn't necessarily always that way, particularly for women. In order to explain a little bit, I'm going to jump back to this an older idea known as coverture, which maybe you've heard about in various of your classes. But coverture comes back from English common law and earlier ideas than that a woman was covered legally by the men in her life. So by her father if she was a daughter, or by her husband if she was a wife. So there's this idea of her being covered legally. And that meant that a lot of times women's citizenship was seen as a derivative citizenship. And it would come into conflict sometimes with the 14th Amendment, but the idea of the derivative citizenship is that a woman's citizenship, just like her legal standing more broadly, comes from her father or from her husband, and can be affected by these. So for instance, in 1855, so before the Civil War and before the 14th Amendment, a law was passed enabling white male citizens who married an alien woman, a woman who was not a US citizen, to make that woman a citizen by virtue of marrying her. So if this woman, again,